So welcome to the International Peace Institute, and thank you for joining us here today. Today we have a discussion in partnership with the Carnegie Corporation of New York. And this is really continuing the trend of events that we've done this year at IPI, looking at how to define and measure peace and the evidence we need to show progress in terms of peace building and sustaining peace. A lot has been written on this topic, and today we have a really excellent panel featuring 4 distinguished speakers who have all looked at this question from many different angles. The focus of this specific panel today is looking at the role of participatory approaches to understanding what peace means in different communities and what progress in achieving this peace means. We know that local communities, those directly impacted and living with the realities of violent conflict, are the experts on the problems that they face. And they are the ones that know what solutions are needed to make peace possible in their communities. They are the ones who notice the small changes which make up peace, and they should be the ones who define what this peace really means and what daily signs in their life determine whether the communities are at peace. By allowing indicators to be developed by communities themselves, we can learn a lot about what kinds of projects the communities really need to try and improve the situation. Over the past few years, we're beginning to see a growing chorus from the international community in terms of trying to go local. We see new efforts to shift policies, funding, and practice towards local leadership, backed by a strengthened understanding that without true local engagement and leadership, even the best international peacebuilding efforts will not succeed. One of these big shifts that we've seen within the international context is this move towards sustaining peace. Sustaining peace emphasizes the prioritization of the local and ensuring that the work of the international community complements and supports initiatives of local actors. In order to operationalize this line of thinking, there is a need for greater understanding among international peacebuilding practitioners and policymakers of the work that local peacebuilders are undertaking to build and sustain peace. Too often our priorities are set from national elites and international stakeholders without adequate consultation or incorporation of local knowledge and expectations, and without recognizing the often significant influence and reach of local civil society organizations. In this event at IPI, we are looking at the work of the Everyday Peace Indicators Project and the upcoming book by Pamina Frichau on reclaiming everyday peace, local voices in measurement and evaluation after war. The findings of this work are really interesting and relevant to this discussion on measuring peace and show us that the international peacebuilding efforts are not always very effective at achieving peace by local standards because of the disproportionate attention paid to reconstruction, governance, and development assistance, with less of a focus paid on actually what heals communities. As an alternative, the Everyday Peace Indicators Project advocates for an approach that seeks to assist communities, practitioners, and policymakers to question the assumptions that underlie the existing peacebuilding measurement and allow us to better understand these terms that are usually difficult to measure, such as peace and reconciliation. The value of such an approach is that it allows communities themselves to define what peace means. And we know that, for example, in many different contexts, peace means something different, like walking to school safely, like being able to have access to running water and electricity. So through this participatory approach, indicators are based on what changes people expect to see, and thus projects can be introduced which target these changes. So in this event, we are really going to focus on this notion of participatory approaches to developing indicators for peace. And this is the work that Pamina will raise, and our following speakers will really build upon it, referring to their research. Before I introduce to the panel, I would like to welcome Dr. Steve Del Rosso, the Program Director of the International Peace and Security Program at the Carnegie Corporation of New York, who is our partner on this event today, to provide some welcoming remarks.
First, let me say good afternoon and welcome, and let me thank IPI and particularly Leslie for co-sponsoring this event with Carnegie Corporation of New York. Let me provide a bit of background on this project because it was originally funded as part of a joint request for proposal with the Canadian IDRC back in 2012. And I distinctly remember because I was during Superstorm Sandy, I was reviewing proposals with a flashlight in my home where I didn't have electricity for 11 days. But this project came to the fore during that experience. And it was, the RFP was on eliciting and applying local peace-building research, local research for peace building and state building. And that has really been a mantra of Carnegie's work on peace building for the last decade or so. Of course, this notion, as this audience knows quite well, has been around for a long time, even before the OECD DAC talked about the importance of local ownership and leadership. Subsequently, the Secretary General's advisory panel on the UN peacebuilding architecture called for genuine local input and moving away from sort of technocratic top-down approaches. And if anyone has read the most recent edition of Foreign Affairs on the related subject of peacekeeping, you'll see one of our panelists, Severine Atasere's piece on how peacekeeping needs to be informed, strategies needs to be informed by bottom-up approaches that draw on local knowledge. Well, as a funder in the peace-building field, which one of our grantees has called a field still in the making, and I would subscribe to that as well. We're particularly interested in this nettlesome question of evaluating the peace-building interventions that have taken place in the world, particularly given the rather spotty record of approaches, top-down approaches developed in the global north. We at Carnegie have been funding a number of efforts on the evaluation side of the equation. Particularly, I can name one at the Alliance for Peacebuilding, where we supported a peacebuilding evaluation consortium, and a DM&E for Peace, which is about to conclude this year. The EPI project, Everyday Peace Indicators, seemed to hit the sweet spot for us because it not only was dealing with this thorny evaluation challenge, but it was also consistent with our interest in local knowledge. And it was refreshingly untechnocratic in that regard. So the original grant that we made way back in 2013 was a gamble on our part, but a gamble that I can say has paid off because of Pamina Furcho and her partner, Roger McGinty, who's now at Durham University. I recall about three years or so, we had a meeting of grantees at Carnegie, and Gert Rosenthal and other members of the Secretary General's advisory group were there, and as I recall, were particularly impressed by Pamina's presentation on this issue. So as Pamina will describe, the approach in her book, Reclaiming Everyday Peace, is both intuitively appealing and methodologically rigorous. And as she'll explain, it's not attempting to substitute for top-down approaches, but in fact a complement and to assist those efforts. So with that, I'll turn the floor over to Pamina. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Steve, and thank you to the Carnegie Corporation and the International Peace Institute for hosting me today and hosting all of us, and for Leslie and Aaron for making this happen. I'm very grateful. And I also thank you all for being here and for your interest in finding ways to amplify the voices of people who may be marginalized or silenced in peace-building and development work. So the first part of my book, Reclaiming Everyday Peace, provides a conceptual and methodological discussion about the utility of participatory numbers. That is, numbers that are generated from the bottom up using rapid rural appraisal techniques and participatory action research. One form of creating participatory numbers, as Steve mentioned, the Everyday Peace Indicators presented in the book, addresses challenges with top-down measurement of difficult-to-measure concepts like peace or reconciliation. It provides an alternative that involves people in the generation or the creation of tools used to create numbers and statistics that can then be used by policymakers and practitioners to make decisions based on local level priorities and needs. So since the 1950s, the measurement of peace has evolved significantly. Although much of measuring peace still primarily involves measuring armed conflict and war, such as the Correlates of War project or the database of the Uppsala Conflict Database project, there have been some other global attempts at measuring peace, most notably the Global Peace Index and the reconciliation barometers, such as the South African Barometer, which was the first reconciliation barometer started in 2003, and more recently, SCORE. In addition, project-level evaluations in monitoring and evaluation occasionally attempt to measure impact on peace and reconciliation, but those primarily use randomized control trials. And all of these efforts have in common that they are top-down, external, and prioritize expert indicators. So why is this problematic, and for whom is this problematic? The challenges with a top-down process of indicator generation and quantitative measurement is reflected in the debates between interpretivists and positivists, where interpretivists are generally more concerned with capturing all the attributes of a concept, as well as the relativity of concepts, because they're trying to interpret the world, right? Whereas positivists are more concerned with what is measurable, generalizable, and identified as belonging in a metaphorical data container, or conceptual data container. And because they're concerned with measuring and tracking over time, right? So these contrasts are somewhat of an epistemological caricature, but they represent some of the main methodological tensions that exist between peace builders working from different standpoints and represent the potential bridges that everyday indicators could build. This extends to those concerned with who is prioritized and represented in measurement and indicator development processes, which have been crucially important for procuring resources and funding in the development and peace-building sectors. The quantification and measurement of impact in these sectors has skyrocketed, and evidence-based decision-making has become the norm with the professionalization of the field of peace-building or the fields of peace-building and development. For the most part, as many of you know, without numbers behind something, there's really no hope for advocating on its behalf. Therefore, these numbers, which are usually based on indicators, are of incredible importance and should therefore also be based on the needs and priorities of recipients of assistance rather than just the understandings of what outside actors and experts believe is necessary. So how does the everyday indicator approach address these debates? Well, the everyday indicators use existing information based on what I call indigenous technical knowledge. That is the body of knowledge generated or acquired by local people through the accumulation of everyday experiences, community interactions, and trial and error that people use in their daily lives to determine whether they are more or less at peace. The everyday indicators systematically capture these indicators and analyze them in order to be able to say something quantitatively about local peacefulness according to locally generated indicators of peace. So for example, an indicator like being able to walk alone at night might be coded into a daily security category, or an indicator like seeing antennas on rooftops might be coded into an infrastructure category. These categories are then aggregated into dimensions like security or development. And the indicators can then be used in longitudinal surveys to track change over time, or you can do iterative indicator generation workshops to be able to see how those indicators change over time. And so instead of using people exclusively as data sources, like more traditional approaches do, and this is really important, the everyday indicators involve people in the generation of the tools to collect the data, as well as sourcing them of data. So people are involved in making decisions about how we source them of data. This also increases measurement validity, as we are able to be more certain that what we are measuring is peace or reconciliation to people that are living it, or whatever difficult to measure concept we're trying to say something about. And this is according to the local definitions of what that means to people experiencing these concepts in their daily lives. So I don't have time to go over the methodology here today in detail, but there's more available on our website, everydaypeaceindicators.org, and also obviously in my book. The second part of the book goes on to use the everyday peace indicator methodology to make claims about peace-building effectiveness at the local level using quasi-experimental matched case studies of villages in Uganda and Colombia. Villages in the study had as similar as possible demographics, histories of violence and displacement, religious and ethnic composition, but vastly different levels of intervention after the violent events that happened in them. Villages were matched for their similarities in everything but the amount of intervention, with the goal of matching villages that had little to no intervention with villages that received enormous amounts of external interventions. And these resulting in these villages with a reputation among the international community as laboratories for peace. My findings show that the localities with high levels of intervention particularly prioritized social issues, such as community cohesion, interdependence, conflict resolution, over security and development when identifying their everyday peace. This is important because efforts at attending to social cohesion and social psychological factors were least attended to by external actors in these villages. And there was clear external priority given to governance and security reform, job creation or livelihoods, and infrastructure. Although these are all important elements of assisting communities after war, they also bring with them unintended consequences that, if left unattended, have counterintuitive consequences. For example, the building of a road into a village can bring in unsavory new visitors that affect community dynamics and challenge traditional community norms, which are already significantly weakened because of the war. Creating new jobs may seem admirable at first, but at closer examination, these jobs may be taking away youth from traditional farming and agricultural practices, and the traditional community structures are so weak or no longer exist at all because of the war in order to support these youth to flourish. A flurry of interventions that support the material functioning of a community allow people to proceed on autopilot by being guided by external actors rather than actually rebuilding their communities and social ties. Therefore, with little attention paid to the relationship building and reconciliation efforts in communities with otherwise high levels of intervention, my findings suggest that there is no overall substantively higher level of peacefulness according to community-generated indicators of everyday peace than those with no intervention at all. The results suggest that there are disparities between what localities need after war and the interventions external actors prioritize in their peace building and reconstruction efforts. This means that conflict-affected communities with large amounts of what I call big P peace-building assistance or assistance in reconstruction and development require more interventions pertaining to social cohesion and community social relations than those with little to no assistance. Infrastructure, security, and development projects are usually prioritized over relationship building, and actors often end up substituting the building of a road for real engagement with the core or the root causes of a conflict. In fact, these localities are actually much more in need of the kinds of relationship building efforts that can be supported by the international peace-building community than those that have to rely entirely on their own efforts in reconstructing their communities after war. This means that without a significant investment in the social dimensions of peacebuilding work, such as dialogue, conflict resolution, memorialization, and trauma healing, broader peacebuilding interventions, such as reconstruction efforts and governance or security sector reform, will not be effective at establishing sustainable peace. In addition, although the localities in the study prioritized social cohesion-related indicators when defining their everyday peace, overall, people chose indicators that fell into multiple categories representing positive and negative peace, demonstrating the multidimensionality of peace. This is relevant for measurement since the majority of top-down attempts at measuring peace use indicators that focus primarily on violence reduction and therefore may miss important elements of what comprises the actual building of peace after war. Also, the fact that people define and identify peace differently from context to context and over time has major implications for how we measure and evaluate, as is reflected in this passage from the conclusion of my book. In a follow-up focus group in Atiak, I found myself debating with the participants about an indicator they wanted to eliminate from the original indicators list developed by the community 3 years prior and used in this study. I was in Uganda to reconvene community members from Atiak and Odek to test and update the initial list of selected indicators. This particular group in Atiak was insisting that one of their previously selected indicators was no longer relevant. Incidentally, the indicator in question was the only indicator used by EPI that is included in the measurement of SDG 16, walking alone safely at night. I argued to the group that actually this would be a good measurement of peace in their community, but the villagers did not agree. They insisted that this particular indicator was now obsolete, since no one in the community felt safe to walk alone at night any longer due to increased insecurity. Therefore, it could no longer be considered an everyday measure of peace. With recent crime waves precipitated in part by the large influx of South Sudanese refugees to camps near Atiak, the perceived insecurity of villagers had increased dramatically, so much so that they no longer dared leave their homes alone in the evenings. Therefore, the indicator had lost its utility for helping villagers to assess whether they felt more or less at peace. As we can see, how people understand and identify peace is not only multidimensional, but it's also multitemporal, and it changes over time. Therefore, the findings of this study have major implications for how we measure peace conceptually, as well as how we measure peace-building effectiveness on a project level. It demonstrates the importance of including localities in the generation of statistics and numbers, and not just treating people as data sources. And it stresses the critical importance of the social dimensions of peace-building interventions, which are often forgotten or sidelined in the rush to reconstruct or to stabilize. The everyday peace indicators and the wider field of participatory numbers has incredible potential to help us advocate on behalf of marginalized people, where their needs and priorities may get lost in an increasingly quantitative world that prioritizes numbers for policy change and guidance. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pamina. I think that your research really provides us a huge amount to reflect on in terms of these debates on how, as international actors and the UN system as a whole really works to try and build and sustain peace in the long term. To continue our panel here today, we have 3 speakers who will respond to Pamina's work as well as bring in tenets of their own work in terms of evaluating and measuring what peace looks like in different communities. Our first respondent is Professor Séverine Orteser, a professor of political science at the Barnard College of Columbia University, whose forthcoming book, Frontlines of Peace, looks at the role of ordinary people working to build peace, some of who exist in peace despite the outbreak of violence all around them. So, Séverine.
Thank you so much, Leslie, for the introduction. Thank you, Leslie and Steve, for organizing this panel and for inviting me. And thanks to all of you for coming today or for watching us online. I share Pamina's frustration with the way international peace building operates on the ground. And I wrote a book about that a couple of years ago. It's called Peaceland. And in my Peaceland book, I explained that foreign peace building too often prioritizes top-down actions and outside expertise. And I show that it has devastating consequences. And of course, Pamina and I are not the only ones who are frustrated with current international peace building strategies. People who have dedicated their lives to peace building agree that our templates and techniques for approaching war and peace just don't work. Inhabitants of war-torn countries and onlookers from the outside have gone wary of the apparent inabilities of government, peacekeepers, and international institutions to promote what they view as a state of peace. And plenty of books and articles have discussed what has gone wrong when we've tried to build peace in the past. But what has gone right? If we want to end war, we have to understand how to build peace. And to me, the exciting dimension of this panel is that we're brainstorming how to do just that. Yes, there are countless problems with the way international peace building operates on the ground, but there are also solutions and ways forward. And Pamina has just told you about a fantastic solution to address the issues that we currently have with our measurement and evaluations of peace-building efforts. And now I'm going to tell you about an alternative way to build peace, which is the focus of my new book manuscript on the Frontlines of Peace, and which you'll see works very well with the approach that Pamina just presented. The main argument of my new book is that, contrary to what most politicians preach, building peace doesn't require billions in aid or massive international interventions. It often involves giving the power over to ordinary citizens. It can even mean respecting superstitions and beliefs in magic that initially may seem bizarre. Ultimately, many successful examples of peace building in the past few years have involved innovative grassroots initiatives led by local people and at times supported by foreigners, often using methods shunned by the international elite. So that's the counterintuitive and ultimately hopeful argument of my new book. On the Frontlines of Peace, tell the stories of the ordinary yet extraordinary individuals and communities that have found more effective ways to confront violence. Rather than focusing on failed initiatives and on handshakes between presidents and abstract peace agreements and negotiations between governments and rebel leaders, On the Frontlines of Peace details the concrete, everyday actions that actually make a difference on the ground. Some of these are bizarre, some are creative, some involve age-old traditions, and some are just common sense. And my book, just like Pamina's book, both explain how peace building can work better so that we can finally improve the lives of billions of people. I show that to end violence from war and address lesser conflicts at home, we have to change the way we view and build peace. So let me tell you just two brief stories to illustrate what I talk about in the book, and of course I'm more than happy to tell you more about any of my findings during the discussion if you're interested. One of my chapters tells the story of Ijwi, which is quite literally an island of peace in Congo. For the past 20 years, the deadliest conflict since World War II has raged around Ijwi, and anywhere between 2 and 5 million people have died due to this conflict. But Ijwi itself has avoided mass violence. And to me, this is all the more surprising because the island contains all of the same preconditions for conflict that have fueled generalized fighting in other parts of Congo for the past 25 years now. You have a geostrategic location, mineral resources, ethnic tensions, lack of state authority, extreme poverty, local conflict over land and traditional power, and so on and so forth. And what's fascinating about HW is that orders comes not through police cameras, guns, and ammunitions, but through local participation. The island is peaceful because of the active, everyday involvement of all of its citizens, including the poorest and least powerful ones. It's not the army, the state, or the police who manage to control tensions. And it's not foreign peace builders, or it's not any outsiders. It is the members of the community themselves. And they have done that by fostering what they call a culture of peace, by organizing in grassroots associations and local structures that help resolve conflicts, and by drawing on strong beliefs that help deter violence against by both insiders and outsiders, such as blood pacts among the main families of the island. So blood pacts are traditional promises between two families who promise never to hurt each other. The story of HW shows us that local community resources can build peace better than the usual elite agreement and outside interventions that we usually focus on when we evaluate peace-building efforts, as Pamina has told you. And the thing is that HW is not an isolated case. And again, I'm more than happy to give you more examples during the discussion if you're interested. But the important point for this panel is that the usual international approach is to ignore these kind of local initiatives. Instead, we should fund, protect, and support these local initiatives so that we reinforce them. We need to build on local expertise, and we need to involve in the design, planning, and evaluation of international programs, not only the elite based in national capitals and headquarters, but also local beneficiaries, local leaders, and ordinary citizens. So that's really, again, to me, it's really important that we involve these people in the design and in the implementation of the actual peace initiative, in addition to doing like what Pamina told us, which is to involve them in the design of monitoring and evaluation strategies. And to involve these people in the design and implementation of peace strategies, in addition to the strategies that Pamina has presented, I think that there are role models that we can learn from. And one of my favorite ones is the Life and Peace Institute. So the Life and Peace Institute, LPI, is a Swedish peace-building organization that operates in multiple conflict zones and focuses on working at the grassroots. And its teams in Congo have developed an approach that they call participatory action research. The broad principles are that the LPI Congo team bases its actions on in-depth local expertise, and they reject universal approaches to peace building. They rely on local employees supervised by a few foreigners, and these foreigners usually have extensive pre-existing country knowledge and an extensive existing social network. LPI doesn't implement programs directly. Instead, it works with and through a few hand-picked local organizations, and the main role of these organizations is to support local people on the ground. These local organizations empower ordinary citizens to develop their own analysis of their community's conflict, to think about the most feasible solutions, and then to implement these solutions. So you see the difference with the usual way to build peace in conflict zones. In the LPI model, it's not foreigners based in headquarters and capital cities who conceive, design, and implement peace-building initiatives. And it's not national or provincial elite either. It's not the state or the government. Instead, it is the intended beneficiaries and local communities themselves, including ordinary people, who conceive, design, implement, and evaluate peace-building initiatives with the help of LPI and its local partners. And in my research, I've found a lot of this kind of original, out-of-the-box approaches by interveners who did manage to put local people in the driver's seat and to actually make a difference on the ground. And again, I'm more than happy to talk more about that during the discussion if you're interested. And obviously, we can combine the approaches that Pamina and I presented, given that Pamina's everyday indicators for peace are the best way, the absolute best way to evaluate the results of the approach that I recommend. Because again, the argument that Pamina makes and that I am making is not that we should get rid of top-down initiatives or top-down ways to evaluate peace efforts, but instead we should merge them with both bottom-up peace-building and evaluation strategies. So these ideas and the many others that Pamina and I present in our respective books, they will not be magic wands, but because they take into account deeply rooted causes of conflict and deeply held perceptions of peace, they can definitely be game changers. Thank you.
Thank you, Séverine. I think you really have emphasized the need for us to look at the resiliencies in society and look outside the box for our approaches which take place. So to continue this discussion looking at resiliencies and the role of different actors in building peace, we have Mr. Graham Simpson, the director of Interpeace USA and the lead author of the recently released independent progress study on youth peace and security, who will bring in the focus and the lens of youth within the approaches of building and sustaining peace.
Thank you, Leslie. Thank you very much to IPI, to Carnegie, and particularly to Pamina for this opportunity. I think the research that's on the table and the approaches that have been adopted are extraordinary and a rich and fantastic contribution to the field. I come to this in a way through two lenses. The one is work that my organization did in 3 countries in Guatemala, Liberia, and East Timor over a couple of years on developing a framework for assessing resilience. And our focus on this was very much about reorienting our approach and engaging in participatory action research from focus group at the district level in all 3 countries, very local focus group research, but also using that in order to, as a participatory tool, to develop, along with the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative, HHI, national surveys in 2 of those 3 countries, so that we could start using the participatory and inclusive focus group approaches so that local actors who were the key stakeholders in this could actually help us in the design, in participatory polling, in the design of the questions we needed to ask, so that our quantitative data was very much driven by a participatory process through the qualitative process. And the focus of this research on frameworks for assessing resilience was really about asking the different question, one that I think resonates very strongly with what Séverine was talking about, which is what are the factors that communities and people themselves identify as the critical issues that either enable their communities to resiliently deal with the past legacies of violent conflict or to prevent the emergence or re-emergence of new patterns of violence and conflict. And so both a backward-looking and a preventive orientation and trying to ask the question about resilience rather than about our more traditional conflict analyses, which tend to focus on risk and fault lines. And there I think what we were talking about, and this again resonates very strongly with what I think Pamina has called indigenous technical knowledge, what we called endogenous know-how, knowledge embedded in these communities, tools embedded in these communities. I'll come back to this because I think we have to be really careful of oversimplifying and romanticizing this, and it's not a challenge to the work presented by others. It's an existential concern that I think we wrestled with ourselves that I'd like to share with you in a moment. And the second lens on this has been the Youth Peace and Security Progress Study, which was very much about recognizing, mandated by Security Council Resolution 2250, and with a unique mandate to look at the positive contribution of young people to prevention of violence and to addressing conflict. A very important orientation, because what the first thing young people were sort of saying to us in a very participatory process, which I'll describe in a moment, was that they are subjects of terrible stereotyping, which treats young people as almost inherently associated with violence, very gendered, young men with guns as the problem to be solved, the threat in society, and young women often consigned to the passive status of victimhood. And yet young people were saying to us, these stereotypes completely deprive them of any sense of agency, of their role as peace builders. And the study's key mission was to discover and to through participatory processes what young people were doing and how they were doing it as an alternative path, as one which offered an alternative to the highly securitized investment in youth as risk, youth as problem, to start thinking about youth as an asset, youth as a source of resilience, youth as a vehicle for peace building. And I should say that what was very clear on this, and this relates also to young people's perceptions of themselves and how the policy community in stark contrast understands them, what we saw very clearly and very powerfully was how young people described very accurately areas of policy mythology that were very, very seldom based on solid evidence, but which predetermined the way in which young people were viewed and the ways in which the international community and the multilateral system was investing in this problem. Either assumptions that youth bulges as a proportion of populations produced increased levels of violence and conflict, the policy panic associated with young people as migrants and the assumption that this was producing increased infiltration, risks of terrorism, threats, people stealing jobs, growing conflict, or were still the assumption that all young people were somehow vulnerable to being recruited by extremist armed groups. And what we discovered is there is almost no evidence to support any of these policy assumptions, and massive amounts of evidence, if you talk to young people, to fundamentally contradict it. And yet the international community, driven by the policy assumptions and policy myths, is investing massively in youth as a risk, instead of recognizing this unbelievable, creative, resourceful space of resilient youth peace building, which offers a powerful alternative and arguably more effective preventive measure for investing in youth-led peace building. So what does youth-led and youth-based peace building look like? What were we discovering? And I won't go into this in detail. There's a kind of a rough typology of youth-led peace building produced in the study, The Missing Piece, but it's fascinating what it tells us. Young people in their peace building work are working across the phases, all the phases of a peace and conflict continuum. They're not waiting for us to invent sustaining peace as an engagement with preventing the outbreak, the escalation, the continuation, and the recurrence of violent conflict. They are working across all of those arenas in early intervention models, right through to post-conflict peace building. They're doing this. They're working at different levels in society, recognizing both bottom-up and top-down approaches, from the most local, intimate peace building, people-to-people peace building processes in communities and families, through to national and global networks driving the establishment of Security Council resolutions. They are working across typologies of violence, recognizing that whether it's about female genital mutilation, the risks of terrorism, the issues of political violence or criminal violence, often there are fudged and transmuting dividing lines between these categories, and they are very astute in understanding how that works and what to do. In many respects, and I should say the techniques and methodologies they're using challenge us in ways. I think we have an enormous amount to learn from the way in which young people are using sport, culture, arts, their occupation of cyberspace, their loss of confidence in representative democracy, and a real belief that there are spaces for direct participation that they are claiming. They are challenging our assumptions about inclusion, saying, actually, your words inclusion often suggest you are including us. You're inviting us to sit at your table where we're setting our own table. Come to us. I think this is a powerful graphic illustration of the endogenous knowledge that we are failing to learn from in the way in which we think about peace building. So this resonates very powerfully. I won't go into any more detail. We did this through, in a nutshell, wrestled the UN from a rather narrow approach to consultations around regional consultations, the real danger that would involve the usual suspects, a handful of young people from each country who understood UN policy, who spoke English, who had passports, could travel, and through partnerships with civil society organizations, yes, seamlessly under the radar, circumnavigating what is seen as a very difficult relationship between the UN and civil society organizations, we created access to young people who were former combatants, indigenous young women, second-generation migrants in the neighborhoods of Stockholm. This was not just in conflict-affected societies in the global south. 281 focus groups in 44 countries, 7 regional consultations, 29 country case studies or country-specific research, etc., etc. An extraordinary participatory and inclusive process. And the real danger is that in all our recommendations, we cease the participatory approach. When we start saying, how do we measure progress? How do we assess progress on this agenda? That's the point at which we have to extend the participatory and inclusive approach. All of the unique data that we've got is as richly served by recognizing that if we ask young people on the ground in these countries, what constitutes meaningful progress for you, they will tell us. And they will also be astute as to the fact that this changes over time, that the priorities are not the same from country to country, that this has to be granular enough to be context specific, but they will also produce generic knowledge. I want to pose 4 or 5 quick questions, and they're just questions that I think really challenge us. The first one is, how do we ensure that this is not so trapped in the local, and that it's not also at risk of, in a sense, romanticizing or worse still, patronizing local actors by seeing them as having somehow uniform voice on these things, rather than homogenous, differentiated, often conflicting views of these issues. I think this is really challenging to our assumptions about the local and the value of the local. I think that it's illustrated so powerfully in our framework for assessing. Well, let me say in relation to this, young people proved that they are incredibly astute at understanding where their interface with the state exists. And this was really important, whether it was in the arena of education or the arena of criminal justice. Young people were able to say, this is our primary interface with states. Their perception of the local and their relationship to the state and to their role in relation to state policy and government policy making was very astute. We need to be really careful we don't fail to recognize this. How do we navigate these indicators when the line between positive and negative forms of resilience is often a very fine line? That actually the social cohesion that we seek as an assumed positive attribute can very easily form the alternative places of belonging and social cohesion in gangs. Vigilante groups or neighborhood watches are 2 sides of the same coin. We need to understand that these local illustrations of this can play themselves out in different ways. What does that mean for how we measure? And this is not unique to conflict-affected societies in the global south. This is not a characteristic purely of atavistic native communities at a local level. This is as true a concern over the view of what makes people feel safe and the difference between perception and reality in the US. Guns. People think guns make them feel safe. They will often articulate this in that way, and we need to recognize they're wrong. It doesn't. So how do we navigate around populist discourses, around the threat posed by migrants that may be very popular, very rooted in local communities, but actually may be counterproductive? So I just want to push us to think in challenging ways about this. And the last one I'll raise is this. Our work on resilience, I think, illustrated that sometimes we can see resilience which is absorptive and adaptive, communities under pressure, taking on things that enable them to survive the most terrible circumstances. And then there is resilience which is transformative, which addresses the underlying causes and which changes those communities. And thinking about how we measure progress and how we assess progress from a peace-building point of view, I believe demands we think about the relationship between palliative and ameliorative measures that often have real traction and meaning at the local level, and transformative measures that are about addressing underlying causes. And sometimes they are not simply separate from each other. The one evolves into the other over time. I think these are really interesting challenges, and I'd love to hear what other panelists think about this.
Great. Thanks, Graham. I think you've really posed a lot of interesting questions for us to consider during the discussion section. So to round off our panel, we have our last speaker, Ms. Michelle Breslauer, the Americas Program Director at the Institute for Economics and Peace, which work a lot on the Global Peace Index and the Positive Peace Index, trying to measure the levels of peacefulness in different societies and what are the determinants of peace. So Michelle, over to you to round us off today.
Thank you. So I'm going to come in now with some of my top-down metrics, but in hopes of showing how we can bridge some of the findings and the comments presented today and see where there are commonalities, but also see where these different approaches might be able to impact some of the international policy agenda. And so I want to share a little bit about what we've learned from our metrics. I want to thank the Institute for Economics and the International Peace Institute. I want to thank Pamina, the panelists, and Carnegie for inviting me here today from the Institute for Economics and Peace. And I think what the panel so far has emphasized that's resonating a lot with the work that we're doing is, one, the multidimensionality of these issues, the fact that we can't just think about them in a linear way, that we have to think about how violence, conflict, and peace plays out across a multitude of areas and to multiple people. And two, the very significant difference between what drives violence and what might be supporting peace. Not only the fact that those are different, but also that they might have an interplay. So I think that there is a role for these broader national level metrics, for this top-down approach, for bringing together the data that exists and seeing how it can reflect trends, how it can provide an umbrella, for instance, for interpreting some of the local level indicators that were generated, for instance, through Pamina's work, for coordinating investments and interventions, and for calling attention to the systemic nature of peace. So my organization, IEP, produces the annual Global Peace Index. We've done that for 12 years now. And that looks at 23 different indicators trying to assess the absence of violence or the absence of the fear of violence. So in that context, we're looking at essentially a violence index flipped over. What is the outcome? What is the state of peace in a country? And it's important to remember that we're looking at a multitude of different indicators. So we can go beyond thinking about things like just armed conflict, for instance, as a measure there. But we also produce the Positive Peace Index. And the Positive Peace Index is looking at measuring the attitudes, institutions, and structures that are sustaining peaceful societies. And this is a framework that we derived through statistical analysis, comparing thousands and thousands of data sets to the results from the Global Peace Index. So through that, we've developed an 8-part framework. And that 8-part framework, those 8 pillars, consists of low levels of corruption, a well-functioning government, a sound business environment, free flow of information, the acceptance of the rights of others, which includes measures, for instance, of group grievances, particularly important to this discussion, equitable distribution of resources, high levels of human capital, and good relations with neighbors. And I'm going through a fairly longer introduction of this because I think it's important to give you the background of a few of the reflections that I'm going to share today that support the discussion that we're having. So if we compare these two indices, we're able to look at both inputs at the societal level and outcomes. So essentially, the Global Peace Index each year is measuring the outcome of the Positive Peace Index. And there's a lot we can take from those measures. So what have we learned from what this data says about the most peaceful countries in the world? The most peaceful countries being those with the lowest levels of violence. The most peaceful countries have a strength in all 8 pillars of positive peace. And so looking at the positive peace framework and how we can apply it at the national level, we can see that it's a way to start to conceptualize and understand a country's level of resilience. So countries with high positive peace are more likely to maintain their stability and to adapt and recover from shocks. And they reduce their risk of conflict relapse. So when we think about this, it's not just about looking at what a state of peace currently is, but where are their capacities and opportunities? And what do we know about changes? What have we learned about the countries that are improving in peacefulness, particularly relevant to the policy agenda? Number one is that simply addressing the factors that led to violence in the past will not be enough to sustain peace. Different aspects of the social system push society toward or away from peace, which means that improvements in peace require broader and more systemic strategies than we currently think. Peace building needs to be solution rather than problem-oriented in order to be effective. Number two is that successful peace building is characterized by sustained effort and improvements in many areas at once. So our research has shown that unbalanced levels of positive peace can be as dangerous as weak positive peace. So that's to say that if some of the pillars are significantly stronger than others, the system can become trapped in a cycle where it returns to the same place over and over again, a place where some of the pillars are out of whack. And that dysfunction can express itself as violence. And this is similar to some of the concepts and challenges that Pamina mentioned at the beginning when she spoke about unintended consequences of certain interventions. Sustained growth in positive peace is associated with improvements in peace overall. And improvements in all 8 domains likely reflect comprehensive efforts across different parts of society, such as governance, corruption, and relationships between groups. So the data, again, is supporting some of what we're learning from the everyday peace indicators about the need to address reconciliation and social cohesion. Number 3 is that countries improve their level of positive peace countries that improve their levels of positive peace in the years following the end of armed conflict established a durable peace 74% of the time with just a 26% relapse rate. And peace begets peace. Cessations of hostilities are 20% more likely to hold if all neighboring countries are also without armed conflict. So we need to think about some of those broader relationships. When we take a closer look at the data, we saw that countries that were emerging from low levels of peacefulness, so by that I mean those that are emerging from armed conflict generally, had a particular set of indicators in common. And those indicators were a reduced access to weapons, so a motive and a mean for violence there, higher levels of youth development, perhaps strengthening those youth peace builders that Graham just mentioned, improved economic freedom, reduced hostility to foreigners, and better relations with neighboring countries. So in terms of how we're thinking through and using some of these global findings, firstly, communities themselves can use these general findings and the positive peace framework to anchor their approach to identifying local indicators that support those pillars and that support these national level improvements. The 8 pillars of positive peace can help peace builders address the key aspects of societies that peaceful countries have in common. Positive peace, which creates the resilience to maintain negative peace, orients metrics and programming towards the factors that create and sustain peace, which are empirically distinct from the breakdowns that lead to violence. So one way that we're trying to use this framework, and I think that this supports some of the approaches here, is that we're doing a series of workshops in a variety of different communities and countries around the world. They have so far been targeting youth. And the idea is that we're taking these 8 pillars that I mentioned at the beginning and allowing these groups of youth to talk about how those 8 pillars manifest in a particular context. So not only do they discuss whether they think these are elements that support peace in their community, they can interrogate them, they can talk about what may be missing, they can learn about the multidimensionality of each one of those pillars. More particularly, the focus is on understanding the interactions and the relationships between something like equitable distribution of resources, high levels of human capital, and low levels of corruption, for instance, so that they can start to think in a more systemic way about how a peace system operates for them. But they, in turn, can also help provide us with more information about how they see these very broad pillars relating to their particular context. And through that, we can have a different type of framework for engagement where we're bringing some of these global indicators to a more local level. And I think that what I take from some of this panel and what I think is particularly important is that despite the fact that people in this room might have an acknowledgement that we need to really start to study peace the way Severine has done, the way Graham's studies have done, the way Pamina has done, I don't think that there's a broad understanding from the policy community that we really need to understand the different factors that make up risks of violence versus components of peacefulness. And I think that all of these approaches and bringing them together helps amplify those ideas about what actually builds peace in a community and different solutions to do that. So I hope that the discussion now that we go into will help merge some of these concepts and frameworks, and thanks for your time.
So I'd now like to open for discussion. I think we have about 20 minutes to take a couple rounds of questions, and then I'll turn it back to the panel to respond. So if you just want to raise your hand and the microphone will come to you.
Hi, I just wanted to ask a question. It's Michael Robbins from IPI. I just had one comment and then one question. My first comment is that I think that especially with the 8 countries of peace that you were talking about, or the most peaceful countries in the world, I think that a big factor that affects their peacefulness is the fact that their geostrategic location. So Bhutan is probably on that list, and they're like in a mountainous region of the world. So I just think that also some other Scandinavian countries I'm sure are on there. But my point was just that I think that looking at the pillars of peace and then setting that aside from their geopolitical or geostrategic position shouldn't be forgotten, because regardless of what the indicators are, lots of small homogeneous countries have peacefulness not because of the indicators, but just because they're small and have homogeneous populations. And then my question is for Ms. Furchow. I was just curious if I'm not sure how to really go about this. Do you think that the problem with having too many indicators is that you sometimes hit the target for the indicator but miss the point because poverty along with peace is not a static issue? Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Michael. I think Renata had a question here at the front.
Thanks, Leslie. Thanks for a very interesting panel. Sorry, Renata Segura from the SSRC. I had a question, Pamina, about your book, which I only got today, so I've only very recently looked, but 2 things that I am wondering about. One is, what do you do in cases in which the community they don't have the same opinion about what is peace? And I imagine that there are a multitude of factors that could make a community very divided on that. So, methodologically, how do you go about that? And my other question was, how do you understand top-down? Looking quickly at the 2 case studies that you look, like I see that you use Fundación Semana and another foundation in Uganda, which are not local, right? They're local from the capital, or at least in the Colombian case. How do you decide what is top-down? Is it less top-down because they come from the same country but from the capital? Is there a significant difference between that and somebody who comes from New York? I mean, I'm just trying to figure out how we really define those levels.
Yes, hello. I actually, to further give 2 concrete examples to what Graham mentioned, I don't know who of you know the documentary that's called Bling, that was done in 2007. And what they did, they took a few artists from the Staten Island-based hip-hop group Wu-Tang Clan to Sierra Leone to introduce them to the issue of conflict diamonds, because a lot of hip hop artists have these chains with diamonds and stuff. So they took them there. UNAMSIL was still there, flew them up country to see the diamond mines, see the terrible things. And that changed their mind. They talked to other hip hop artists saying, well, listen, these diamonds might be nice bling, but there's a downside to it. And then another thing, tomorrow at CUNY, there is the African Union Expo 2018, which bring together mainly African students, diaspora, showing exactly what young people are doing. Like there's these two friends of mine from 54 Kingdoms, very talented Ghanaian fashion designers. So this starts at 10 o'clock, 25 Broadway, 7th floor. So everyone who wants to get inspired by what young Africans are doing, check that out. Your mind will be blown possibly. Thank you.
Great. I think we can take a few more. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Yeah, my name is Rukai Mohammed. I work with UN Women. Yeah, my question has to do with the everyday indicators. Now, the conflict we have of late is not really conflict between two people or two tribes in the community. There are a lot of external actors involved. So I really would like to know, how do you, especially with these locally driven indicators, how do you factor the role of regional organizations and even other countries that supply arms and actually fuel the conflict? How do you take them into consideration in developing the indicators? Thank you.
Great. And I think the last question we can take from John here at the front.
So first of all, thank you all very much. What strikes me is that these are not brand new ideas, and my question is whether the UN, DPKO in particular, is deliberately obtuse, in other words, does not want to hear these points, whether they are conversely totally unaware of all the research. You know, in other words, why is it that after all these years, these recommendations have not, at least in part, been implemented? What is the constraint that is preventing the UN system, the UN, from carrying out at least some of these ideas? Thank you.
Great, thanks, John. I'll turn it back to Pamina, and we'll go through the panel to just provide some responses to some of these points.
Thanks, Leslie, and thanks for the questions. Michael, I'm not sure entirely understood your question, but I think what I caught from it was that you're wondering why it's important to look at the multidimensionality of peace. Is it should we just be looking at violence reduction to simplify matters? And I think as we think towards building peace, we have to take into consideration that there are other factors besides just stopping violence, which in and of itself is a real challenge. But moving beyond just focusing on violence reduction is important as we think towards building peace. I didn't catch your name, but in terms of your questions, which were great, thank you. So in terms of the diversity of understandings of peace within communities and how we mitigate or circumvent that, well, the process can be done in multiple ways. The way that we do it, or we have done it until now at the village level, is a majority rule process. So that means that minority views oftentimes will not be included because there's a process of different workshops, focus groups, and finally what we call verification process, which you'll read about in the book, that includes community members ranking indicators, and we are very intentional in including different sectors of that village or neighborhood that we're working in, but ultimately it is those that get the most votes that are included in the list of indicators, because we want to be representative of that community. And there are limitations to that, but there are also strengths to be able to say something about a particular place, right? And decisions always need to be made in measurement, right? In terms of how do you decide what is top-down and what is local? And I think this is a really important question, and one that I'm concerned with a lot, because I feel that oftentimes we conflate local with national. When we talk about local within the international community, oftentimes what we're talking about is a country or perhaps a capital city. And it confuses me, because when we talk about Washington, D.C., or what's happening in New York or London, we aren't referring to the local unless it's in a neighborhood. But suddenly when we start talking about South Sudan or Juba or Uganda or Kampala or Uganda, it's local. And so for me, Oliver Richmond, who's a peace building scholar, talks about the local in order to really distinguish the difference between local and national. But I don't think that should even be necessary. We should be talking about, when we're talking about local, we should really be talking about village, communities, perhaps sub-district local. And specifically to your question about Fundación Semana and the civil society actors, I guess, that we partnered with to do the work. Fundación Semana, which I worked with in Colombia to collect the data, had a long-term presence in one of the villages that was a laboratory for peace, and was one of the reasons why so many actors came to that village, El Salado, in Montes de Maria. So they did, I mean, although they are obviously also based in Bogota, they did also have a very local presence. In terms of regional organizations and external actors in this indicator generation process, well, I mean, it's a local process, so it has to be something that not just regional organizations, but international actors also have to have the desire and the need to be able to use this as a tool to connect the local understandings of what it means to build peace with their own structures, which is a huge challenge, and I think speaks to your question, which I might leave to my colleagues, about why this isn't being integrated already and what the constraint is. But I guess I'll leave this with a last thought of the fact that, you know, part of the problem is that our way of thinking is often in very concrete, linear, as Michelle put it, terms, timelines, log frames, project cycles, and peace building doesn't always work that way, and it can be counterintuitive. It can be disruptive. It can be messy. And so the challenge is, how do we actually integrate that into project cycles and the way that we work, or do we need to think about changing the way we work, and thinking about integrating participatory action research methods or participatory approaches to measurement for the necessary accountability to donors, and make a case for the need for these kinds of structures, especially when it comes to peace building, which is very relational and very much rooted in social cohesion and relationship building, community building.
Great. Thanks, Pamina. Severin?
Thanks. So given that Pamina let me answer the question that John asked us, I think, John, that's the million-dollar question. And that's one of the, as you may remember, that's one of the starting points of my Peaceland book, is we know that there are things that don't work, and yet we keep doing the same thing over and over and over again. And I'm still puzzled, although I wrote a whole book on that, and I'm still trying to figure things out. I think the problem, there are two main things. The first one is that very often when I talk with people at the headquarters across the street, at the United Nations headquarters, or in foreign affairs ministries or places like that, and I try to talk about local, bottom-up, everything that we've been discussing so far, people tell me, like, yeah, you're cute with your thing. Like, it really doesn't matter. Like, it's not as important as elite agreements, etc., because that's what really matters. So the first thing, I think, to me, it's really just no acknowledgement that it really matters. It's just as important as the elite agreements, as the high-level negotiations. And it's even worse when we're talking about everyday things, about whether a woman can sleep in her pajamas at night, because that to her it means that she's safe and that the rebels are not going to come to her house, or whether they hear the dogs barking at night. Like, it's really to people, to a lot of diplomats I meet, it's not as important as whether or not the president has signed a peace agreement. So that's the first thing. Like, just, it doesn't matter. The other thing is, people are very defensive often when we talk about that. When I say people, I mean leadership of the United Nations and leadership of major foreign affairs ministries. And I think that the defensiveness, like, they're defensive, and often they're, like, actually aggressive as well. And I've been wondering if it's because we're basically jeopardizing their entire worldviews. We're telling them that everything that they've believed, like everything that defines their very identity, actually doesn't matter. And so, for example, when we tell them, well, sovereignty is not the most important, and you're violating sovereignty on an everyday basis, so why are you telling me that sovereignty is an obstacle to working on the ground? That basically goes against their entire worldview, which is sovereignty is a sacred principle, non-intervention is a sacred principle. Same thing when we say that there shouldn't be international, interstate organizations, they should also work with ordinary people, etc. And that leads also to the fact that they don't have the structures, they don't have the expertise, they don't have the people. So basically what we're asking them to do is to change not only their worldview, but also their everyday practice, the way they work on an everyday basis, to change their colleagues, to change their entire offices. So we're requesting, by making this very supposedly minor criticism, we're requesting huge changes, and that's why I think we face so much resistance. Although we've been saying the same thing. I mean, Robert Chandler was saying that about development in the 70s, so it's definitely not a new criticism. And I just want to build on what Pamina was saying in answer to Renata's question. To me, one of the useful way I think about that is I distinguish between outsiders, insiders, and top-down. So outsiders would be anybody from outside of the community in which we're intervening. So if we're talking about a country, it's foreigners. If we're talking about a village, can be national elite, can be even someone from the provincial capital. And then you have top-down, and top-down, to me, that's when we focus on elite, so national elite and state structures and state bureaucracies.
Great. Thanks, Severin. Graham?
So I'll start a little bit with John's question. I mean, I think there are a few things, and I'm not sure how helpful these observations are. The one is that it was very striking for me over the last 2 years listening to young people talk about the whole holistic, integrated experience of their lives, in which their experience as victims of human rights violations, their experience as impoverished and marginalized, their experiences of political exclusion, their experiences of gender-based marginalization were inseparable. And yet the international community tends to bifurcate its funding streams in ways that segment this. And I think that that is a structural problem. I think we're wrestling with trying to bridge these silos in our operational approaches within the system, and it is completely detached from the integrated lived experience of ordinary people. And it's fascinating because I think when we get from the local to the global, we see this integrated lived experience at the local level, and when we and it's true of international NGOs, not just true of the multilateral system. I think we see this sort of bifurcation and segmentation of the way in which we think about people's lives and problem solving. The second issue is about money. It's about where we spend our money and how difficult it is to turn that tanker around. I mean, for me, the very simple issue in the Youth, Peace and Security Progress Study is about saying we have an alternative avenue for investment here that requires very little. The survey of youth-led and youth-based peace-building organizations that was undertaken by Search for Common Ground in partnership with the United Network of Young Peace Builders for Us demonstrated that the vast majority of youth-led and youth-based peace-building organizations operate on tiny budgets, highly localized, based on very local issues of trust, etc., etc. This is not expensive, and we are spending trillions of dollars on hard security approaches to young people as a problem, and we are extremely poor at reorienting that. Having said that, I think there are also some really important challenges for us. One of them is a do no harm approach to these things. Young people themselves were saying, we need more resources and we need more money invested in what we do. They were saying, fund the partnerships and the creative partnerships that we are forging across sectors and in different ways. They were saying, help us to professionalize our field and scale it up so that we're not just operating locally, we can expand our impact, and help us to measure it. And all of these things present, I think, implicit dangers for them. That unless we do this smartly, the danger is increased spending can pollute these environments, can change voluntary-based and locally rooted organizations in very dangerous ways. Partnerships can result in young people losing rather than gaining power in their partnerships. The professionalizing and scaling up can detach young people from the local trust-based, highly engaged community orientation. And perhaps most relevant to this conversation, the gravest danger is that we start demanding impact assessment and measurement tools, the linear approach that we've talked about, that log frame them out of existence, that basically destroy the very risk-taking and innovation that makes some of the outcomes of what they're doing unpredictable, that we are desperately interested in investing in and supporting. We can kill it by the way in which we insist on impact assessment. So I think these are all issues that really plague the way in which we are wrestling with this. And the last thing I'll say is this. I think there's a challenge for us here. And I own this because it's one that I think we have really wrestled with. This intense, detailed, rich, powerful, illustrative work that shows what ordinary people say and do. How do we move it from being trapped at the local? How do we get it to speak effectively to policymakers who are having to both, who need to be able to absorb the granular relevance of it, that it's granular enough to have local meaning, but is generic enough to have policy relevance. And I think we are clumsy at this, and I think that our orientation around the local all the time is good and solid. I mean, I'm owning it, but I think it presents us with real challenges of how we speak into a policy community that is thinking about that complex interface between the granular and the generic.
And Michelle, any last thoughts?
Well, just to address the question that was specifically directed at me about wherever Michael is, about the role of geography and where some of these countries are placed and how that plays into measuring peacefulness and whether it sort of negates our understanding of peacefulness in these countries. You just quickly, in the top 10 countries of the Global Peace Index, Bhutan is not in the top 10. And the Scandinavian countries that top well-being indices, while they might show up, they are not all there. And one of the reasons that you see a lot of the Scandinavian countries falling out of that coveted role is that they are some of the largest arms exporters in the world. And so when we're taking a look at these various dimensions in the Global Peace Index, it starts to, broaden the way we're thinking about some of these issues and look at some of the interplays. When we're looking at positive peace and the 8 pillars of positive peace, then the idea is, while we derive that framework from looking at the countries that are ranking the most peaceful in the world, even though that has its challenges with data availability and making these sort of generic assumptions that were referred to, what we have is actually a very powerful framework to be able to push the way people are thinking about elements that might construct peace, and allowing them, whether they're in a national government or the international policy, or perhaps within a certain community, to think through how those play out, it starts to pull away from some of those factors that might be specific to certain countries. And so just like the example that Severine mentioned, within one country you had an island of peace, and many other communities like that have the same geopolitical risks attached to them. What is it that's making that area more peaceful? How can we use these frameworks to try to better understand that? I think that my co-panelists were very eloquent and specific in their recommendations for how international policymakers may be challenged by some of this. They were much more diplomatic than my answer, which would have been that there's a struggle for power and maintaining power involved in so much of this, and to try to break that down is very complex. But I think that, I appreciated what Graham said about the convergence and the struggle between this sort of generic findings and interrogating the local, because I think that's where we have a real gap here, and where this type of discussion and bringing together all these different pieces of work is particularly relevant, because we can start to try to bridge that gap, knowing that people do need more direct, simple messages and actions to move forward with.
Thanks, Michelle. I think that we have to wrap it up now, but I encourage you, if you have further questions, to engage with the panel afterwards. I really want to thank you all for joining us here today. I think we had a really rich discussion on measuring peace, and really focused on the need to keep local perspectives at the front and center of all we do. I think for me, it's really challenged us to consider as international actors what our role is. Is it to heal or to harm societies? And to continually reflect on that as we are working in different contexts. But as Graham said, there is still a lot of work that we have to do to try and move the needle in terms of the policy discussions. I think that we've seen this year there's a real appetite for it. There are a lot of reforms taking place. The notion of sustaining peace, it's really welcoming, I think, this dialogue that the current tools that the UN has are not working, but there's still a struggle to try and connect the rich findings that we have of different examples, as we've heard today on the panel, with this huge sort of complex and bureaucratic nature of the UN and the policy world. So I hope that we can continue this discussion next year. I hope that we can try to demystify some of these contexts and these concepts and make progress. And with that, I'd just like to thank the panel once again, and thank you all for joining us, and enjoy the rest of the afternoon.